to
This
record it.
conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so this is Everyday Herbalism, a beginner's guide. And yeah, so we're going to kind of talk today a little bit about bioregional herbalism, what that means, what are the pros, what are the implications of it. And then we're going to kind of get into the more nitty gritty. We're going to talk about some herbs. We're going to talk mostly about how to work with those herbs. And so, you know, there's a vast majority of, or just a vast population of herbs out there. And so it's hard to really talk about too many of them when you're trying to go in depth and also talk about how to make them. So I'm going to kind of focus more on the herbs that are in the sampler packages that went out if you got one. And then we're also going to touch on some other herbs as well. So I want to start with bioregional herbalism. So I'm wondering, someone can start talking if you want, we'll see how it goes, but what does bioregional herbalism mean to you? Anyone?
I'll go.
Yeah.
I think just learning around or about the plants that are around you, kind of knowing what their benefits are, and also learning how to utilize them in your, you know, somewhat relatively daily life, and also learning how to recognize them when you're out and probably being able to gather them, or, you know, I don't know, gather them, use them, harvest them is the word I'm looking for.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. So yeah, bioregional herbalism is as simple as understanding the local ecoregion around you and what's growing there, and then, you know, basically utilizing what's in your backyard. So there's a lot of fads out there right now with all sorts of different herbs. There's all sorts of miracle cures out there. And because of that, you know, there's now an international trade of herbs, which is great in certain respects, because there's a lot of amazing herbs that we don't necessarily have here that have a lot of value for, you know, something like the coronavirus, or, you know, our daily lives of, you know, tonifying the body or working on the liver. But oftentimes, a lot of those herbs that we're looking for that are potentially across the ocean, we can find those same medicinal qualities in those herbs that are often overlooked or considered weeds, or, you know, just the herbs that we don't really know about. And a lot of the herbs that are common in herbalism actually grow in a lot of different areas in the US, mostly because they got brought over, but you know, also because in certain areas there's the same similar climate, and so those plants grow. So what do you think you know, we've kind of talked about it, but what do you think the pros would be for kind of approaching herbalism from a bioregional stance? And anyone can go and shout out something.
I'm gonna go again. I just we have so many really cool plants in New Mexico, and a lot of them do look like weeds, and they're just growing in our front yards or the sidewalks. And I just think it's really cool that, I mean, most people consider them weeds, but they're actually really useful. And we do have a lot of diversity in New Mexico. If that's where you're from, that's where I'm in Albuquerque. So there's a crap ton of plants growing in my side yard that I can use for stuff, and I think it's really cool.
Yeah, definitely.
That's what I think.
Yeah, for sure. And so, you know, with every positive, there's kind of always a critical analysis of that. So, you know, what do you think would be some cons or some implications for a more like if bioregional herbalism became more popular with communities?
Definitely overharvesting.
Overharvesting?
Yeah.
Yeah. What else?
Being considerate of people in your bioregion who might be using those plants already, like indigenous people. We have a lot of indigenous people up here in Michigan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so understanding kind of the cultural role that plants play in the certain areas that we're living in, and how to navigate respecting that, or you know, not going to those areas, possibly not using those herbs, things like that. Anything else?
Definitely. So those kind of cover it for me.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think overall bioregional herbalism is a very positive thing. I think it encourages people to understand and recognize native plants. I believe there's a lot of plant blindness out there, a kind of coined term, that we oftentimes overlook individual plants, or plants as a whole, because we're looking at the ecosystem as a whole, or we're looking to save animals, or we're looking to save the water systems. But plants are the basis for everything. And so by creating that relationship with plants in your local area, I feel like we have a deeper respect for them. We have a deeper understanding for them, what they need, why they're there, you know, what can make them go away. And so I think, you know, approaching herbalism from a bioregional perspective can like create that respect that you have for the land that you're working on, and hopefully not have the over harvesting happening. You know, it creates more of that relationship, so that you're not relying on outside sources, and you have more of an appreciation, and therefore hopefully will continue to conserve the land. And so that's kind of how I view bioregional herbalism. I know there's a lot of different ideas out there and opinions about it, but for me personally, I know that since I've started working with, you know, more local plants and local weeds, I definitely have gained a greater understanding for the environment that I'm living in, and why things grow the way they do, and, you know, why it's important to encourage those various plants in those various ecosystems and ecoregions. So yeah, great. So, oh, sorry, I want to go back on this. So talking about harvesting. So when you get into the practicality of actually going out into the wild and harvesting, there are some sort of guidelines that have been put out there by trial and error, or you know, research from folks that kind of provide you an opportunity to harvest in the right way. And one of those, that's a very big one, is the percentage at which you harvest. So basically, when I was working for the Native Plant Society, I was working in partnership with the Institute for Applied Ecology, which is another local organization in Santa Fe here that focuses heavily on native plant ecology, restoration, conservation, and cultivation as well, to restore native plant populations here in New Mexico. And one of their rules of thumb, because we'll go out and collect native seed for the purpose of growing out or revegetating land, is when you go out to a population of plants that you're going to be collecting, you should collect 20% of any given population area that you are collecting from, as well as around, you know, 20 to half, depending on the type of plant that you're harvesting from, 20 to half from that plant specifically. Some plants like to be harvested from. Nettles, for example, if you go out in the spring, you clip their tops off, that actually encourages that growth to keep going, and the plant actually likes it. It's like a little haircut for them. But if you go out and you you know, try to dig some root plant in spring or summer, you're going to get rid of that plant in its entirety, unless you leave a little bit for it to continue to grow. So recognizing that we can only harvest a certain percentage of the population that we're looking at, as well as specific plants. And so I would love it if someone came up with a book for that, or just like had some more information. I know a lot of us herbalists have just kind of learned it through talking with other people, or how we learn from understanding what the plant biology is. But so that is a really big rule of thumb, is really understanding what to harvest and how much of a plant. The other thing is understanding where you're harvesting, getting permission. So if you are on public land, depending on what kind of public land that is, you might not be allowed to harvest from there. National forest, typically you're not allowed to harvest without a permit. You can get a permit, but there's kind of some rules around that. Oftentimes what we do is we work with a lot of farmers who have a vast natural space, and we'll go out and harvest on their land specifically, or obviously have them cultivate things from us. So having permission, understanding harvesting only certain percentages of plants, knowing the plant life cycle and understanding when the best time to harvest is a huge thing as well, because you don't want to kill the plant off either because you've harvested in the wrong time and it can't set seed or something like that. So, you know, I know for folks here in New Mexico, for example, if people are going out and harvesting Osha, then it's really, really important because one, of over-harvesting of that plant, two, because it's a finicky plant, you know, we can't really cultivate it. It grows naturally in a very specific area at a high altitude. Understanding the life cycle of that plant, if you are going to harvest it, waiting for it to set seed in the fall and harvesting at that root and making sure that you're only harvesting a certain 20% of that population. Goes the same for any other plant. Also, making sure to rotate your harvesting locations as well is a really important thing, because you don't want to devastate a population and come back the next year and see that you harvested the whole thing and, you know, now it needs time to regrow. So if you come back and you only see a few plants, probably shouldn't be harvesting from that space again. So yeah, and there's of course other, you know, sort of guidelines and things to follow if you're trying to be a mindful harvester, but those are kind of some of the big ones, and you'll find it in all of the sort of ethical harvesting and medicinal books of you know, what you should do and how to behave and things like that. So yeah, you can kind of do some more research on your own and see what you find, and also kind of create your own protocol for how you harvest. A lot of people will put down an offering before they harvest as well, just in gratitude and appreciation for the land. So whatever it is that you do, that's great. But yeah, so those are just some different tools and tips. So let's get into it. So you don't need a big fancy lab to make herbal preparations. It can be as easy as having a stove, a pot, and a spoon. So some common utensils that one might want to have in their kind of herbal arsenal of things to use is muslin cloth or cheesecloth, some sort of strainer. I got this one at an antique shop a couple years ago. It's a really, I don't know, it's kind of old school, but it's fun. So it comes to a funnel here so that you can put the herbs in, put the menstruum in, and let it drain out. And then there's this that you can kind of tamp down on it and get the rest of the herb out. And these are actually pretty common, I found. You can find them obviously at antique shops. You can also find them online. But I really like this one specifically because it does kind of come down to a point, and you can put like a glass underneath it or a bowl, and it's a little bit less messy because it's kind of got its own stand as well. Obviously you want to have some sort of stove or hot plate if you're going to be heating things up. A double boiler is great so that you're not burning your oil or burning your herbs, but it's not necessary. You can also use a metal pot if you have a hot plate. You can also use, you know, a glass pot if you're cooking on the stove, or a metal pot. Ceramic is less used. It's typically glass or metal. A scale is great if you're trying to get a little bit more scientific or exact with your measurements. If you're using the folk method, it doesn't matter so much, and we'll talk about the folk method a little bit later. As far as utensils go, I like metal or plastic. I don't like wood. It can kind of get gross and grow different bacteria and get into your plants and your preparations, and it's just not my personal favorite. I like to stick to metal or plastic just because I know it's clean and isn't going to create any more growth because we're letting things sit for a while when we work with them. Coffee filters are great. When we're filtering off tinctures, we'll use a coffee filter. If you don't have a coffee filter, you can use a paper towel if you want. Some people don't like it because it's bleached, but if that's what you got, that's what you use. You can use a crock pot. Don't have to use it, but if you got one, that's a great tool. You can use a dehydrator, which are really awesome. But again, if you don't have access to a dehydrator, that's okay. You can use an oven and just put it on the lowest setting that you have. Typically for dehydration, it's nice to have it between 120 to 220 degrees, depending on what you're going to be dehydrating. And you can also just dry plants on a clothesline, or you can set them on a screen. I've taken my window screens out of my windows before, out of my whole house, and I set them out and put my plants on that because that's what I had at that time. And then of course the cutting board and a knife and jars and all sorts of stuff. But those are some kind of good things to have on hand. And like I said, you can kind of be a little more extravagant with it, with the double boiler or a dehydrator, but you definitely don't need those things in order to be successfully making medicine. So common measurements, and I want to just say that I'm going to have this presentation available along with a lot of other information that I'm kind of just like talking about right now. I'll have it in a written form. So if you don't want to take notes, you don't need to. If you want to, that's great. But I am going to send all of this to you so you have it in your packet of information. So yeah, just want to let you know, but common measurements, when I started working for Artemisia, I realized that I didn't really know a whole lot about measuring. I've cooked before, I don't really bake. I find baking to be too detailed and too specific. I don't like measuring things, but it's really helpful. It's really helpful to know, conversions of measurements as well, especially when you're doing formulation with tincturing and doing smaller portions of formulas and multiple herbs and understanding how to calculate things out. So that's just one thing that I kind of found interesting and learned along the way and memorized some of these things so that I could understand a little bit more about how I was going to measure out everything I was doing. Something that we don't necessarily think about when we're first getting into it, but measurements are a good thing. Knowing your herb is really great. So when you're making medicine, there's a couple different ways to make it. You can do the folk method, which is awesome and easy. And basically you throw some herbs in a jar, you pour your menstruum. Your menstruum is essentially any liquid or whatever you're going to be infusing. And call it good, let it sit, do its thing, don't worry about it. Or you can become more scientific with it and follow some of the protocols that have been designed for more commercialized or standardized medicine making. And so that's actually measuring things out. And I've done it both ways, and I love doing it both ways. And to be honest, we actually do it both ways at Artemisia, depending on what we're making. So we really deeply believe in having consistency, but also understanding that medicine making is a alchemic process, and it's going to be somewhat different every time you do it, but in some ways it's still going to always be the same. My boss Susan is constantly, she is just so, it's incredible to watch her work. She is a magician and she's a witch. She just puts things together when she's creating an initial product through her own intuition. And I'm a more logical, linear person, and so that was really hard for me to kind of wrap my brain around at first. But I've come to really appreciate her way of making medicine and understanding that it's good to also follow your intuition about how much of an herb you think should go into something versus just being very standard. Like it should be a 1 to 2, it should be a 1 to 5. Herbs are different when you harvest them from spring to fall. Herbs are going to be different from one herb to another. It's hard to really pinpoint exactness with herbalism. People have done it and it happens, but it's also a really beautiful thing to see a marriage between honey and a plant and putting those things together without being super, super exact and just following your own intuition of what you think you should do. I think you can marry those two approaches together and have a really wonderful product. So that's kind of folk method versus scientific. When you're looking at infusions, you want to understand, am I going to be infusing a dry herb or a fresh herb? What does that mean? What do I need to do in order to make that process correct? And so there are some things, for example, when you're infusing fresh herbs in oil, you want to typically dry them out a little bit or let them wilt before you put them in the oil. Oftentimes that'll help release some of the medicinal constituents of the plant. For example, with St. John's wort, you want to let that wilt before you put it in oil. It's got a chemical component called hypericin in it, which actually starts to activate and become released before you put it into that oil, and then it continues that process. Some herbs are going to be really full of water and will mold if you put them in the oil. So kind of understanding your herb in terms of using it fresh or dry, and some of those processes of what to do to properly infuse it. And what's the best mode? Some herbs actually infuse a lot better when they're fresh, and some herbs are better when they're dry. Same thing with heat and activation or cool infusion. Sometimes heat's going to be a really good activation component for certain constituents of a plant. Mushrooms, for example, really enjoy having heat to pull out some of those medicinal qualities of the plant. So, herbs are all different. They all like different things. So, what does an herb fancy? Figure it out. And then what can go wrong? And so, like I said, if it's too wet, your herb might mold in your honey, or it might mold in your vinegar or your oil. If it comes to the surface of the oil or the vinegar and is exposed to air, it becomes it's an oxidation process that's going to break it down. It is going to start to mold. So understanding what can go wrong so that you don't have a nasty product in the end. And then, we're really good at reading the internet, and we're really good at looking things up and looking at websites that may or may not be legitimate and gives a whole bunch of information that may or may not be true. Get a bunch of sources. If you read something about your herb, look at 3 other sources, and does it say the same thing? If it doesn't, try and find that thread of information that follows through multiple sources. And then also experience the plant for yourself. We don't always go outside anymore, but it's good to go outside, and it's good to touch and taste and smell and sit by and listen to the plants that we're working with. Some of people kind of find it woo, but if you sit next to a plant long enough, you're going to learn a lot about it, especially with the anatomy of it too, like understanding what plant family it comes from, what is the leaf structure, why does the nettle sting you when it does, what is that defense mechanism doing. It's just interesting to learn all aspects of the plant so that you can understand how to use it in the right way. Some common terms, I'm just going to kind of fly through these. These are also in a list which is more expanded that I'm going to send to you later. Menstruum is a liquid used to extract medicinal properties. Oftentimes menstruum is typically referenced in terms of tinctures specifically. And then there's a whole bunch of words that herbalists like to throw around of what an herb will do for you. So adaptogens help to work on stress response. They help with adrenal function and working on regulating hormonal levels as they pertain to stress. Borage is an example of that. Reishi is an example of that. There's a lot of different adaptogenic herbs, and it's kind of a trendy word right now as far as mainstream herbalism. A demulcent or emollient. Demulcent is going to be soothing internally. Emollient is soothing externally. Examples are marshmallow and plantain. Nervine is really good for the nervous system, calming things down. Analgesic is for pain. Antispasmodic, really good for spasms or cramping. Astringent tightens and tones. Diaphoretic, helps with kind of inducing sweating and a fever to help break that. Lymphatic, helps move lymph through the body. A tonic helps to tonify the body. It's a very gentle sort of overall support. And vulnerary is sort of wound healing. And then there's a whole slew of other words that are kind of a medical dictionary of what different herbs do. But it's good to know those things when you're looking through herbal books, because oftentimes those are going to get thrown at you. You're going to look at an herb and it's going to have a whole list of chemical constituents, and this is what the herb does. And so just having some of those terms in your back pocket is helpful. So let's work with the herbs. So there's a lot of different ways that you can make medicine. I'm not going to go over all of them, and I'm not going to cover essential oils today. I think essential oils have a time and a place, and I appreciate them, and I don't think that they are necessarily as effective as other means, or as appropriate as other means of medicine. To make an essential oil, it takes a lot of plant matter, and it takes a lot of equipment, and you can do it at home and make it yourself, but it is definitely a process, and like I said, takes a lot of plants. And so in my opinion, I think you can get just as high quality extraction process from doing other extractions, like actually doing an infusion in oil or something else, and it doesn't take as much plant matter, and so you're not going to be taking as many plants from the land. So I'm not going to cover essential oils. I'm sure there's a lot of other folks that will, since they're pretty popular right now, but we are going to go over food. We're going to go over water extraction, oil, vinegar, honey, alcohol, glycerin, and a little bit of essences. And we're going to kind of just go through them on more of a surface level tonight. And I have thought about, if people are interested, we can offer more specific workshops on each of these extraction processes. One of them I thought of was tincturing, because I started kind of writing out this workshop, and you can kind of talk about tincturing for a long time and get really specific with it if you want to. You can also get really specific with these other things too. So we're kind of just going to go through these on a surface level to give you some information of what you can do easily at home, and kind of you can take it from there and do some more research on your own. So medicine is food, food is medicine, right? So, you know, a lot of herbs, oftentimes we're already using things like rosemary, things like sage, oregano, thyme. We're cooking with them. I kind of think that these herbs became popular not only because they taste well and flavor food well, but because often they act as preservatives, and they also have medicinal qualities. So they may have been, you know, taken in ancient times because of those medicinal qualities, and now they just are a common part of our food. Oregano is a really good antibacterial. Rosemary is a great antiviral. It's also extremely good for the brain. Oranges are high in vitamin C. You know, there's all sorts of properties to a lot of the herbs that we're, and even food that we're ingesting, that we don't necessarily think about when we're just throwing it into our pot of stew or making broth or whatever. But you can easily incorporate herbs into your food. You don't have to make them into medicine. You know, you can make a bone broth with astragalus root to help boost the immune system. You can put burdock root into your chicken noodle soup. I did that for the first time this winter, and it's actually got a really interesting flavor, a really interesting texture to it, and it adds a lot to the soup. And it's actually pretty good. So there's a lot of different things you can do. You can make wine with dandelion. Dandelion has a high amount of vitamin D. It's also got a lot of vitamins and minerals. Dandelion leaves are very, very high in vitamins and minerals, and they're excellent as spring greens, either fresh or sauteed. Wild lettuce here in New Mexico is great. It actually has been kind of likened to sort of opium properties, though it doesn't have the addictive quality of opium, but it does have somewhat of a pain reliever. If you've ever seen wild lettuce and broken it apart, you can see sort of a white sap that comes out of it, and that the chemical constituents in that are what really help with pain. And that's a weed that's all over, but you can also saute the wild lettuce greens in the spring before they get too prickly. So there's a lot of options that you can use herbs for. On the bottom here, the purple flowers are chive tops. So you can actually take white wine vinegar and infuse these chive flowers into the white wine vinegar, and it turns the vinegar a really pretty pink color, and it also imparts a really wonderful sort of onion taste. And then you have a vinegar to use for salad dressings. So thinking about ways to incorporate these herbs into your daily life, just cook with them, make food with them, make drinks with them. The picture on the right here is a blend of dried oranges, rose hips, cranberries, and a little bit of cardamom. And I ground that up and infused it in vodka and added a little bit of honey to it. And it's a really wonderful cordial that my mom drinks with a little bit of tonic or club soda. So there's all sorts of things that you can make with it. So let's get into water extractions. So water is, hopefully and ideally, one of the most accessible ways to make medicine. And I was reading the other day some really interesting things about hot and cold infusions and what they do. But first I want to kind of talk about a decoction versus an infusion. Does anybody know what a decoction is and can explain it to us?
Decoctions, usually for like the roots or the bark, and you simmer it longer. Infusions a little shorter, and usually more like leaves and stuff.
And why would we simmer something like roots or bark longer?
Because it takes longer to extract those properties because they're more woody and tough.
Yeah, totally. So you're exactly right. So a decoction is oftentimes done with roots, bark, more woody type plants because of just that. They are, the barrier is a little bit tougher and it takes a little bit longer for that water to actually extract it. And sometimes it actually takes a little bit higher of a heat. So that's why you might want to simmer roots when you're making a tea with them for maybe 5 to 10 minutes. You can always taste the water and see what how strong it is as well to see whether it might need a little bit longer time of simmering or not. But if you're going to just pop a root in some cold water, it's probably either going to take longer or you may not get a lot out of it. Not to say that it won't infuse, but it just might take a little bit longer. So then an infusion is often what we already know. It's just like tea, right? So you get a tea bag that's full of whatever it's full of, powder, leaves, flowers, and you infuse it. And oftentimes what's in those bags is the leaf in little cut and sifted parts, or is the flower chopped up, or if it's a root, it's in a powder form because you've increased the surface area for the extraction of it so that you can actually infuse it. And then you just let it sit in hot water. What's important to kind of note about certain more fleshy herbs and fleshy plants, so if you're working with leaves or if you're working with delicate flowers, too much heat can actually break them down too much. And so that's why you do want to actually heat the water up and then do more of an infusion process with them too, instead of actually boiling the plant because it'll break it down because it's a little more delicate. Hot versus cold. So this is something that I didn't actually know, and I thought was really interesting when I was reading it in the book the other day. So both hot and cold water are going to extract sugars, proteins, different products, tannins, acids, minerals, and salts. but they're going to work in different ways. So certain herbs like to be extracted in cold water to get certain medicinal qualities out of them. An example of that is marshmallow root. So if you've ever had marshmallow root before, it kind of is this sort of gelatinous substance after an infusion. And what people will often do, it's really good to coat the throat, coat the mucous membranes, soothe irritation, help with a cough, help with a sore throat. And so people use it when they're sick oftentimes. It's also really good to help with the digestive tract and the mucus lining of the digestive tract as well. And so one of those reasons is that mucilaginous substance that comes from the marshmallow root. And so one way that you can extract that is to actually take the root. It can be in a powdered form or it can be in a dried root form. Put it in a jar of water, put it in your refrigerator and let it sit overnight. And that'll extract that or create that sort of mucilaginous substance that's going to be working for you. And it actually does enjoy that cold to pull that out. With hot water, the interesting thing about that is it actually works. If you think about how heat affects anything, it makes things expand, right? And so it's going to dissolve and extract compounds at a faster rate. And it really works well for certain things like plant gums. It's really good for essentially helping the cells expand and burst to allow those constituents to be more readily available for extraction. And so some plants that have a more difficult time because of a barrier that they have, putting them in cold water, that barrier is actually going to be broken down and allowed for those constituents to come out in hot water. So I'm still kind of like learning the difference between cold and hot, but I think it's interesting. Certain plants have an affinity for hot or cold water, and you'll kind of find that out as you get to know the plant more and do that research yourself. One of my favorite teas that I actually love making is lemon balm and yerba mate. I do that as an infusion process, and I've taken fresh lemon balm, and that's one plant for me that I actually love to use fresh. It has a more potent taste to it versus when it's dried. It's a completely different flavor. So I've taken lemon balm and fresh lemon balm, dried yerba mate, and infused them in water. And to spruce it up, you can add a little bit of milk and honey to it, and it makes a really wonderful tea, or you can just drink it straight. Another example of a great tea or decoction would be dandelion. So I'm going to kind of reference dandelion throughout this whole workshop just because it's a great plant. It's pretty much growing everywhere. So dandelion root is really great as a tea. And so one of the ways that you can do this, I actually have a dandelion root here. I have a whole plant. And we only got part of it, but this is what the root looks like. So you've got a taproot that's going to be going down, and then you've got other little adventitious roots. And so when you harvest the dandelion, you can actually harvest the entire plant because you can use the flowers, you can make oil with the flowers, you can make tea, you can take the leaves and you can cook them as spring greens or eat them in salad, and then you can use the root. And you chop the root up when it's fresh, because when it dries, it becomes pretty woody and hard. And so you're gonna take the root off of the plant, and then you can just break it up or chop it into little pieces. And then what you can do is either put it in a dehydrator or put it in the oven and let it dry, and it'll also kind of roast it as well. And it really gives a wonderful nutty flavor to the plant. So you just cut it up into small pieces like that and set it on a drying rack or like a pan that you can put in your oven, or put it in your dehydrator. Dehydrate it for likely overnight, maybe a couple of days, depending on the temperature. And it is okay to roast it. It actually gives it kind of a nice flavor when it's roasted. Oftentimes people use this as a coffee substitute. That's pretty well known. It's really good to help stimulate the digestive juices within the tract and support digestion. It also helps the kidneys as well. There's a lot of really great aspects to dandelion that's going to kind of tonify, help with digestion, help stimulate those juices, assimilate food better into the body, all sorts of great uses for it. So tea has been around forever, and I think that it is one of the best ways for extracting. The more I read about it and kind of understand, you know, the different ways of extraction, I think it is a really wonderful way to get your medicine in and really accessible for folks as well. We have had people ask about distilled water. We use distilled water in our tinctures, and one reason people would kind of go to distilled water is because it is essentially void of any contaminants or heavy metals or anything like that, but it also lacks any other nutrients that might be in the water. So I like just using regular water when making tea, and I would not use distilled water for making infusions or extractions. Oops. So oils and salves. So if you have your sampler packet, go ahead and pull out your first product. It's going to be the chaparral oil. And you can go ahead and try it if you haven't already. So oils are great. Oftentimes, you know, when we're talking about oils, we're talking about topical use. However, you can infuse oils for ingesting as well. You know, if you make garlic oil or if you make an herbal oil to mix with a salad dressing, it's the same process as when you're making an oil for topical use. So regardless of what you want to use it for, the process is very simple. So chaparral, if you don't know about this plant, it's also called creosote, and it grows here in New Mexico. It kind of starts I think kind of towards the south end of Albuquerque and then down. People in Las Cruces and southern New Mexico, when the rains come, they say that's what the rain smells like. And I've gone down there after a heavy rain and you can smell that creosote. It is very strong and smells very medicinal. But it's a really unique plant and has a lot of really amazing qualities, and is also a pretty readily available plant as well. If you're driving down the freeway Albuquerque South and see sort of low-level bushes along the side of the highway, that's going to be chaparral. You can also note it by its yellow flowers that once they go to seed create these cool little puff balls as well. But it's a really interesting sort of unique plant with a lot of different properties to it. Has anyone used chaparral before or know what some different uses for it?
Seven Song told me he uses chaparral in an oil for skin infections.
Nice. Yep. Anybody else?
I'm just curious because like I don't know if this has any affiliation with creosote. Is like the chemical like in like railroad ties and like the wood and stuff like that. That's what I thought of, and I'm just wondering if there's any relation to that, or just they just happen to have the same name.
I don't know if someone else can speak to that. I'm not really sure, but I know that like I know it's not the same, and that creosote plant is not going to be necessarily like toxic in the way that that is. But does anybody else know if like?
I can touch on that. They call it creosote plant because I believe it's one of the first plants to pop back up after a burn, after a wildfire.
Interesting.
Yep, that's
Yeah.
all I know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think personally, I don't think there's an affiliation to like the nasty creosote that's going to be a chemical.
I just wondered because that's what I thought of when I heard it. I was like,
I know when I first heard of it, too, I had no idea what it was, and people were calling things creosote, and I was really confused. So you're not alone in that. Yeah, anybody else use it or have another idea of what it's used for? So yeah, so chaparral is great for a number of different things actually. What a lot of people will use it for is sun exposure or sunburns. They'll use it on age spots, liver spots, brown spots, whatever kind of spot you want to call it, but basically like overexposed skin. It helps to kind of rejuvenate that epidermal layer of the skin. It's also really good, you know, there's research around it being really good to help break up fatty tumors on the skin associated with skin cancer, especially as it relates to sun exposure. So yeah, it kind of has an affinity for helping our bodies when we've had too much sun, sunburns as well. And then it also does have great sort of antimicrobial property to it as well. It's one of the ingredients in our Rio Grande salve, which is our antiseptic, antibacterial, antifungal salve. And internally, people will also use it for when they have cancer. However, it is a pretty strong plant. So whenever someone's taking it internally, they're going to be want to work with someone closely, you know, so they don't overdo it, because dosage tends to be important with that plant. So topically, it's great. You can use it freely. People do use it internally, but it's definitely one to caution to use internally. So if you have it, try some out. If you have a little dark spot on your skin, you can start putting it on there and see how it helps. So in order to make this oil, or to make any oil, you are going to have your carrier oil, which can be any number of things. Most oftentimes we tend to use olive oil for ours. It's a simple oil. It tends to not be as reactionary for the skin for most people, and it tends to extract most things fairly easy. Other oils are almond oil, apricot kernel oil, coconut oil, sunflower seed oil, avocado oil. All of them have sort of different properties to them of how they relate to the skin and relate to the body on their own, and then also how they kind of extract plants as well. You also want to kind of think about, if you are going to be heating your oils to do the extraction process, what the burning point of your oil is. For example, with olive oil, it's going to have a pretty low burning point. So you want to be careful so you don't actually create something that's carcinogenic when you're using it, trying to make some medicine. So kind of Artemisia's standard protocol, and I say this is our standard protocol because it doesn't necessarily apply to everybody. You know, other herbalists are doing their own thing. And so there's not necessarily one right way to do it, but this is just how we do it, and is also somewhat more of kind of standard industry for how to infuse oils. So our typical ratio is 1 to 2, 1 being the herb, 2 being the oil to carry it. You're going to take your, okay. So I brought some little demonstration tools to try and make this more interesting and not just be talking at you as well. So you have your oil. So for example, I have a nice big thing of avocado oil here. And when I make everything tonight, I'm going to be doing the folk method. Yeah, so we're going to go that route. But you basically are going to take your herb, and the herb that I'm going to be using tonight is cottonwood. And this is actually cottonwood from Washington State, which is a little bit different than the cottonwood that you're going to find here in New Mexico. It actually tends to be a little more resinous, and I do believe it's a different variety of tree versus the cottonwood that's here in New Mexico. But if you look at these, if you've never seen it before, it kind of looks, sorry, there we go. Almost looks like a little cockroach to me, or like a little weird bug. But they're really, really wonderful as an analgesic or for pain. So I have chronic back pain. I have a herniated disc, and one of the best things that I've actually found to work is cottonwood oil. And people will use poplar buds as well. They have a similar effect. but you want to harvest the cottonwood typically in the winter once it starts to ooze that resin. So it'll be nice and plump and full of that wonderful resin that's going to have that active constituent to help with the pain. And you're going to want to be careful when you're harvesting them. Don't harvest the whole branch. Try to harvest kind of the individual buds themselves. And of course, leaving enough buds so that tree can actually flower and continue its growth. Not only are the buds really good of cottonwood, but you can take the little flowers or the, are they called catkins, I think? You can take them, they're really beautiful. They have like a very vibrant red color to them and they kind of flow over like a waterfall. But you can actually take those and kind of lay them in batter or flour and fry them up and eat them. And they're very delicious in the spring. So that's another sort of like spring food that you can harvest on your own. But so basically what I'm going to do here, so cottonwood buds are very, very strong. So I tend to not necessarily follow the 1-to-2 ratio as much because of that strong resin that's in there. I'm going to just go ahead and take a handful of them. And I'm going to pop them in my nice little salsa jar. I save all of my jars that I have because you never know when you're going to need a good jar. Plus the ball jars are kind of expensive. So I'm actually going to fill, for this purpose, my jar up about maybe a half of an inch all the way up, because that's what feels good right now. And then I'm just going to take my oil and I'm going to pour it on, and I'm going to go maybe like 3/4, 2/3 of the way up the jar here. If you wanted to be more specific, you could take the herb, measure it, see how many ounces it is, and then double it to understand how much oil you want to use. But like I said, certain herbs are stronger than others. And so as you get to know the herbs that you're working with, you may need less herb for what you're working with, or more herb, depending on what it is. If you're harvesting herbs for any purpose, really, it's best to harvest them when they're somewhat dry. You don't really want to harvest them after a rain because they'll be full of moisture. It'll be harder to dry them. They may mold faster, especially if you're going to be putting them into oil. You're going to want to let them sit and wilt or dry out a little bit. So when you're harvesting, it's great to kind of harvest midday and let them dry out a little bit and make sure it hasn't rained for a little while. So you take your plant, you put it in your jar, you pour some oil over it, you've started the infusion process. What I like to do is put the jar in a dark place so that it's not being too exposed to the light, because that'll break it down at a faster rate. So I'll go ahead and put it in the cupboard and let it sit. And what we do for our oils is we're going to let them sit for at least 2 months for our process. And what we do is we actually come back once a week. You can do it every day if you want, if you're getting into it, and either shake them. Well, you don't shake them actually. You're going to stir them. And so one thing to note when you're making the oils is you don't necessarily want to create an anaerobic process for it. So what we do is once we have the herb sitting in the oil in the jar, we either take muslin cloth or a paper towel and just put it over the top and then close it with a rubber band. So you're still allowing for it to breathe, and then it's not going to be making some funky situation in there while it's infusing. And so, yeah, so you don't want to cap it, or we don't cap it. I know some herbalists that do cap their oils and they don't seem to have problems, but we've found that it works best and we have the most success rate when we don't actually cap our oils during the infusion process. Once the oil has sat for a couple of months, you strain it off, and you strain it through a muslin cloth or whatever you've got, and then you can put it in a jar and actually cap it, and it will be fine. Does anybody have any questions on that? Nope. Okay, cool. So that's an oil. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to know, sorry, how long do you let them sit for? You said a month? Or is it different?
We do at least 2 months for our oils as a standard rule. And if you let them sit longer, you know, as long as they're not, the plant matter isn't rising to the surface and getting, you know, exposed to the air and molding, it's okay if they do sit longer. You know, we get really busy sometimes and we don't get to it right away. Sometimes they sit for 3 months, it's fine. But we find that we like to do it for at least 2 months to get a good extraction from it. And another thing I'll note, for any sort of extraction that you're doing, particularly with tinctures and oils, we actually like to either cut the herb up or grind it, and that will increase the surface area and the particles size of the plant. And we find that it actually extracts at a better rate when we're doing that versus having like a whole root put into the oil. It's going to not extract as well as if you break it up into little pieces.
Cool.
Yeah. So like, for example, with our calendula, we love our calendula oil. We get local flowers from New Mexico here. Calendula is a great vulnerary herb. It's great to help regeneration of skin cells on the skin. It's good for burns. It's good for all sorts of wonderful things, aging, wrinkles, all the gamut. We get dried plant. We find that calendula is particularly good as an infusion once dried, and we'll grind it up in our Vitamix with oil to get those particle sizes down. And we do about 1/3 of a pound per gallon for calendula, because it's one of those strong resinous herbs, and we get a really, really bright orange, wonderful colored oil from that. So a salve is as simple as an oil with beeswax or some other wax if you want to use that. A salve is a hard version of an oil, essentially. It's great if you don't like the messiness of an oil. Balms are just really wonderful. I actually have more of an affinity for balms than I do for oils. You can do the method that we just talked about, where you have your herbal infused oil and you add beeswax or some sort of wax to it. I know other folks that'll do tallow balms also. I've never made it. Has anyone ever made a tallow balm?
That's with animal fat, right?
Yeah, so that's with animal fat. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I haven't. I just
Yeah.
wanted to make sure it was.
I've used it for balm, but I've used it to make soap.
Make soap? Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, I've never experimented with it, but you know, like a lot of the oils are sometimes coming from other countries. And I know that with tallow, as long as you're not a vegan, I guess, you're able to use that as a resource that it might otherwise be thrown away. And so people will kind of whip the tallow, which is the fat from the animal, and mix that with beeswax and do like an herbal infusion similar to kind of what we're talking about with the oil and the beeswax. So there's this one woman that I follow. She's called Flying Cow Tallow or something. I found her on Instagram, and she makes tallow salves and tallow balms, and they just look really wonderful. So I like to just mention that because I think it's, you know, an accessible thing for people to be using and experimenting with in the event that we were never able to get oil again. And so how we make the salve, obviously we're doing it in bigger batches. So we tend to do 1 pound of beeswax for 1 gallon of oil. And so if you're doing smaller batches, then you can just kind of calculate that out. However, you don't really, you know, you can also figure it out by trial and error. So if you make your oil, you've got it, you add some beeswax in, it's always best to add less than more. So it's not going to be too hard. If it's too soft, you can always add more. But what I started to do when I was first making salves on my own is I would just have the oil, add some beeswax, I would dip a spoon in it, and I would put the spoon in the freezer and let it harden a little bit and bring it out and just feel it. And if it felt right to me, you know, it wasn't just still super oily or smushy, then I would keep it. If it did feel really oily still, then I would add some more beeswax and try the process again. So if you don't have a scale, you can't weigh things, that's fine too. You can use that folk method again and just kind of add the beeswax in little by little and test it by putting it in the freezer. We at Artemisia also just let things sit for a day. So we'll take a little bit out and we'll set it to the side and we'll come back the next day and try it before actually pouring into our jars, just to make sure that it's the right consistency that we want. Vinegars. So vinegar is, you know, one of the oldest extraction methods people have used in terms of making medicine, vinegar and wine. The tincturing actually came from trying to make a more standardized extraction process for commercialization. But, you know, way back when, ethanol wasn't necessarily like available or high alcohol content unless you were like on the side making moonshine on your own. And people were using vinegar and people were making wine and using wine and doing herbal infusions that way, or making different types of cordials. So vinegar is like a really, I don't know, I think it's a really wonderful method of extraction. Vinegar in itself has a lot of medicinal qualities, particularly raw apple cider vinegar. It's really great for the digestive system. Folks will take it in the morning, they'll do a shot to jumpstart their digestive system and get things moving and shaking. I used to make, back when I was doing really healthy things every single day, I would make a vinegar, lemon juice, honey, cayenne, kick in the pants shot. We called it dragon's breath. I think we even added maybe a little bit of like garlic juice in there, and you mix it all together and then you take the shot back and then you're ready for the day. So vinegar is a really, really wonderful way to extract medicine, and it actually can do a fairly good job of extracting certain properties of plants. It's not going to necessarily pull everything out, but it does pull a lot of the vitamins and minerals. Water is one of the main components in vinegar, and water does a really, really good job of actually extracting those vitamins and minerals, whereas alcohol isn't necessarily going to be pulling those out and breaking those down. It's going to be working on the different sort of constituents or alkaloids that a plant brings to the table. So vinegar and water especially bring something different that can pull other parts of the plant out and make them readily available for you to absorb into the body. So for example, we use raw organic apple cider vinegar, and if you have your kit, one of your little options is pinon vinegar. So we use pinon pine needles, and we actually use basically the entire branch. And so when we're going, we tend to try and find fallen trees or work with folks with trees on their property, and we'll harvest some of those branches. And so you're getting the sap, you're getting the bark, you're getting the needles, you're not getting the nuts, but you're getting all the rest of that good stuff. It's very, very high in vitamin C. And it has also been touted as a great blood cleanser as well. So pinon pine is a really wonderful medicine. Traditionally here locally in New Mexico, people have also used it for cough. So it's got a lot of different qualities to it. So what we do, we get it basically fresh off the tree and infuse it right into the vinegar. And often what we found when we make our vinegars is we like to do things fresh. We think it extracts better and it just has a stronger taste to it. So if you try your pinon pine vinegar, That's what you're tasting in there, is the needles, the bark, the resin, all of that good, yummy, delicious stuff in there, and it is in that raw organic apple cider vinegar. And so when you're making your vinegar extraction, it's a very similar process to the oil. And so what I've got here today is cilantro. So that's another one that we make as a vinegar form and find it tends to extract really well. Cilantro is a great heavy metal detoxifier specifically. And so what I've got here, got a nice big batch of fresh, wonderful cilantro. You know, assuming you don't think it tastes like soup and you actually like, or not soup, soap, and you actually like it, this would be a really great infusion to make. So you just cut up those leaves, the stem, you just cut that whole thing up, and then I'm gonna take it and I'm gonna do the folk method with it again, right? So I'm gonna take my nice little jar, I'm gonna stuff it with my cilantro here. And what's interesting about herbs is each herb is going to be different. Oh, yeah.
I can't see you. Can't see the happenings.
Oh,
What you're doing with your. Sorry.
no, that's good. Did people not see me do the oil?
I saw the oil.
I saw the oil.
Yeah, I can see you.
Oh, you can. Okay, so some people can see me and some people can't.
I think so.
I think it's just that the camera is like angled so that the jar is below it.
Oh, yeah. I'll get the jar up here so you can see it. I'm just kind of stuffing it right now. Okay, here's the jar. Can everybody see it? Whitney, can you see it?
Yeah.
Yes, we can see.
Okay,
Yes.
cool. Awesome. Gotta love technology. Okay, cool. So here we go. You know, that was one head of cilantro. I just chopped it up and put it in there. I've got my raw apple cider vinegar right here. And what I want to note about this that's interesting, this is actually a little old. It's been exposed to sunlight and it has had a little bit of oxidation. So it's actually broken it down and turned it a different color. When we first got it, it was pretty light. But as the vinegar breaks down, it tends to kind of turn a different color. So you can kind of see the process of it changing through its difference in color here. So I've got my fresh herb, got my vinegar, and I just pour it on top. So I'm gonna have to go grab some more vinegar at some point here, but you can see here that it doesn't fill all the way up. So you wanna make sure that when you're doing your vinegar that it comes above your plant that you're working with, you know, at least a ½ inch or so. And with cilantro, especially what we've noticed is we really have to tamp it down. And we check it at least once a week, sometimes twice a week when we're infusing it, because it will create funk on top if you're not careful. So make sure you cover it all the way. It tends to float, so you want to tamp it down consistently. With your vinegar, again, you want to put it in a dark place. Having it be on the cooler side of things is also always a good thing. And with the vinegar, you want to let it sit for at least 3 months is what we do. Yeah, any questions on vinegar infusions? And we don't heat ours ever. We always do a cold infusion, especially because we use raw and we don't want to heat it.
Sarah?
Yeah.
Is the vinegars, do you put an actual lid on that one then? So it doesn't
We do.
evaporate?
Yeah, we lid the vinegars.
Okay.
Yeah.
And when you're doing the ratios, are the ratios in weight or volume?
So the herb is always in weight and the liquid is always in volume.
Okay.
And so, you know, it's one of those things where you're like, well, does it actually translate? But the way, yeah, that's kind of how I was taught, is you were gonna act kind of like as though they they do translate together, if that makes sense. So a 1 to 2, if you have a pound of herb, you're going to be doing 32 ounces of liquid, basically, for the most part, unless it doesn't totally cover the herb, and then you're going to add more. And you'll
Okay.
find when you're making medicine, it doesn't always pan out. So like if you try to be exact, sometimes you aren't going to cover that herb, and you do have to add a little bit more.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
And did you say to store it in the dark?
Yeah, it's good to put it in a dark place. Anytime you're kind of doing that infusion process, especially with oils and vinegars, it just helps them last longer when you put them in like a dark, cooler place. So if you just kind of put it in your cabinet in the back and then check on it, that's going to be the best way to do it.
Cool.
Sarah, when you're checking on it, do you need to do anything with it? Do you need to mix it up again, or do you just check it to make sure it's still there?
We do, so it's good to kind of tamp it down. And so you're kind of mixing it as you're tamping it, essentially. So oftentimes what we've found with the herb is it is gonna rise in the vinegar and kind of sit on the surface, or at least some of it is. So you're gonna wanna go in at least once a week, or, you know, like I said, if you wanna do it every day, if you're excited about this process, it's not gonna hurt it, you can just tamp it down, and it will also kind of mix it, if that makes sense. Okay, moving along. I feel like I always talk too much. So now we've got our honey. So honey is a similar process. Basically, these are all very, very similar in how we do them. You know, like you get your herb and you pour something on it and you let it sit, or you heat it up. And so for honeys are really wonderful. Honey in and of itself is very medicinal. Topically, it's great for burns. It's antibacterial. It is a great healer. It's an anti-inflammatory, antiseptic. It's got great properties. Oftentimes people will use local honey for allergies. So honey is great. It's a really, really wonderful, wonderful sort of medium to take your herbs, and it's delicious as well. And you can bake with it. You can replace your sugar with honey. You can put it in your tea. I actually just like to take spoonfuls of honey and eat them. And like, especially if it's got the osha in there or the lavender, I love just eating honey. It's delicious. So what we do, so there's a lot of thought around honey and whether to heat it or not. Ayurvedic practice says that heating honey actually renders it toxic. So I know for Ayurvedic practitioners, they don't do that. We receive our honey already heated through the process that the beekeeper goes through. They actually do heat the honey already. So we use a heat extraction process for our honeys, and this is where we use crock pots. So what we do is we get our herb and we chop it up like you see here. So this is ginger is what we're chopping here. So we actually get ginger fresh from a local grower down here, or down in Albuquerque. He grows his own turmeric and ginger, and so we get it straight off the farm and infuse it in our vinegars as well as our honeys. And so ginger is a great anti-inflammatory. It's considered a circulatory herb, so it gets things moving through the body, and it's also really great for nausea. I'm sure most of you have heard that. It's great for digestion. It works in all sorts of great ways. It's a great companion to turmeric as an anti-inflammatory. We have turmeric ginger vinegar that we make that's really delicious with the raw apple cider vinegar. And so they marry well as kind of an herbal couple. And so we take the ginger, we get it fresh, we chop it up into little pieces, and we actually do more of a folk method. It ends up being mostly about a 1 to 2 for us for our honeys as well, for the ginger. And for our Osha honey, we use less Osha because it is very strong and it does extract in a larger amount of honey with a smaller root. So for the Osha, we use maybe even like a 1 to 5 for our extraction method. And so the same thing with the root, we chop that up to small pieces and we infuse it in the honey. So you can do a cold extraction process if you want to use raw honey. You just take the herb again. So I'm going to go ahead and I've got elderberry here. And this is dried and I am going to heat it eventually because elderberry is can be considered somewhat toxic in its raw state. There's all sorts of opinions about elderberry as well, but when you're making your honey or syrup, it is nice to heat it up just to kind of be on the safe side to break up those toxins so that it's not going to harm you. So you've got your herb. In this case, it's dried elderberry. In our case, we use the fresh ginger or fresh turmeric. Garlic is really great in honey as well. Then you're going to take your honey and just cover it again. And so if you're doing it in a crock pot or if you're heating it up, you're going to take the honey and put it over your herb and put your crock pot on low. And this is one that's great as a taste test. So when you're doing it, you probably will heat it on low for maybe 2 hours or so. What we do is we'll heat it on low for an hour, we'll let it sit for a day, and we'll come back to it and heat it for about another hour or so on low, and then we'll strain it off. So we kind of do a double heat on it. If you want to just heat it for a couple of hours, that would work too. Taste it, see how it tastes. If it doesn't taste strong enough, let it go a little bit longer. You might want to add a little bit more herb to it. And then you're going to strain it off. And if you're doing something like a root like ginger or especially Osha, because it is a very special plant and pretty sacred, we don't ever throw Osha away. So we chop up the fresh fruit, we infuse it in the honey, we strain off the honey, and then that's what actually candies the root. So same with ginger, you strain off the honey, then you've got candied ginger, turmeric, garlic, whatever you want to do. You can actually maintain that byproduct and use it for medicine as well. And so when you're doing a cold infusion, so I've got my little cup here, I've got my herb, I've got my honey over it. Probably want to mix it because the honey is not hot enough that it's kind of seeping down below the herb. So I would mix it up. And if you are doing the cold infusion, you're going to have it in your jar. You can lid your jar, and then you're going to go ahead and put it again in your cupboard in a dark space and let it sit. It depends on the type of herb. So when I've done garlic before, and I actually tried to candy the garlic, and I let it set for about 6 months before it actually candied the garlic. And it was great because it was chewy, it wasn't super strong, it actually had like a nice sort of more subtle taste to it with the honey. It was still garlic, and it's still, you know, it's always going to be strong no matter what, but it was nice and chewy. It tasted like the texture of it was like candied ginger almost, if you get like a ginger chew from the store. Something like lavender, you might only infuse for a couple of months. So if you guys have your packets, you've got your lavender honey here, you can try that. So we take a handful, probably, I don't know, about a pound or so of lavender or a big chunk. We'll put it in the crock pot, pour honey over it, let it cook to pull out the lavender taste and the lavender constituents. Lavender is a great calming herb. It also has been used locally here for coughs as well. So it's one of the components in our cough syrup. And so you let it heat and then you strain off the lavender. We use the entire lavender plant, or the entire above ground parts essentially. So the stem, the leaves, the flowers, everything, because that's all going to have really good medicine in it. You let it infuse, either cool for, maybe a month or two, come back, taste it, see how it tastes, if it needs to go a little bit longer, or if you need to add a little bit more, let it sit, and then strain it off. The thing when doing cold infusions of honey is it's a little tough to separate the honey from the product in the end. So you just have to kind of figure it out. But when heating it, it is obviously easier to kind of drain it off. Yeah, so that's kind of it for honeys. You can marry vinegar and honey together and create what's called an oxymel. And so an oxymel is, you've got it in your packet. The one that you specifically have is a ginger oxymel. This one's really great because it kind of blends the vinegar and the honey together. And so when you taste it, it's kind of got sort of a tangy, sour, sweet taste to it. And one way that you can use it is you can use it like honey and put it in tea. You can also make what's called a shrub. So you mix it with a little bit of club soda and a little bit of ice. It tastes just like ginger soda to me. It's really good, and you don't need a lot of it. So it's very strong. And you do get kind of the medicinal properties of both the honey and the vinegar that way, as well as the herb. And so this ginger oxymel came from doing ginger infusion in the honey. We strained off the ginger, so we just have the pure honey infusion. And then we added in a little bit of our ginger vinegar to it and mixed them together. So it's a very simple process. You can add more or less vinegar depending on what kind of a taste you're going for, but that's what an oxymel is. It's basically the marriage of honey and ginger, or honey and vinegar together, essentially. Any questions on that so far?
I was wondering about like the texture of when you mix the honey and the oil together. How do you do you like just mix it together when the honey is warm, or how does that work?
You can do either. So so with the vinegar, so you're mixing it with vinegar, not oil, but so essentially we've done it both ways. So when we heat, we pour off the ginger honey or whatever, then it is a little bit warm, and we'll add the vinegar to it and then mix it that way. When we're making our, we make fire cider, or the equivalent to fire cider with a Southwest flair. We call it our Southwest Desert Blaze. We will have essentially like cold honey and cold vinegar. And what we do then is we'll pour the honey into the vinegar jar, and you just gotta shake it. And over time, they're going to kind of come together as one. And it might take a couple days of kind of shaking it 2 or 3 times a day to kind of put them back together. But then you will have sort of that marriage with the two. So it doesn't have to be hot. Cool. So I know it's 8:15. I'm going to kind of try and speed it along and kind of get through this. There's just always so much information that you can talk about with all these different things. So alcohol. People used to make herbal infusions in wines, and that's something that I've never personally experimented with, but have always wanted to. And so I don't have a lot of knowledge on it, other than to say that this has been a long-standing traditional approach to herbalism for a really long time. And people got out of it because, again, there was a lack of consistency through commercialization and a worry for things to kind of go bad, and to, again, not be able to kind of measure, qualitatively, quantitatively what's going on with the herbs. But I think wines are a really wonderful way to infuse herbs and have different myriad of flavors and properties coming together as one. They are similar to vinegars in the way that they extract. And yeah, so if you have an interest in that, then wines could be a really, really cool way for you to work with herbs. if you've ever made wines before, you can also kind of make those wines and ferment those wines with the herbs as well. There's a book called The Drunken Botanist, which has a lot of really kind of interesting information on herbal beers and herbal wines, and can kind of talk a little bit more about that. So with alcohol, however, there are a number of different ways that you can extract, and I'm going to kind of breeze over them. They kind of get a little more specific and scientific the more you talk about them. But basically, it breaks down into 4 common ways of making tinctures depending on the herbs that you're using and the type of extraction process that you want to have. You've got your common tinctures, which are mostly what you see in the market and what people at home will make. And you make them with the folk method, or you can do the more scientific approach to that. You've got percolation, which is similar to a maceration. So a maceration is taking your menstruum, which is a combination of water and alcohol together, that's being poured over your herb, and you let it sit and let it macerate, essentially. When you're percolating, if you can see the picture on the right here, that's a percolation cone. And it essentially speeds up the extraction process. And so you want to use dry herbs for this. You want them to be powdered to increase the surface area of the particles. And it essentially works through a gravitational pull down through the plant over a period of time. You take your dried herb, you mix it with a little bit of alcohol, you pack it in your cone, you pour your menstruum over, you let it sit for 24 hours. Some herbalists think you should sit for 48 hours. So it's personal preference on that. And then you open up your valve of that percolation cone, and what it does is it slowly drips through into your gallon jar, and then you have a tincture within a couple days versus letting it sit for a period of time, which is maceration. When you let it macerate, you are going to want to let it sit for, or what Artemisia does is let it sit for at least 2 weeks. Leaves, flowers, the fleshy parts of the plant sit for at least 2 weeks, and we shake it once a week. If you're excited, shake it every day. And then things like roots and more woody parts of the plant, seeds, are going to be a little bit longer. We typically try to let those go for about a month. If it's in a powder form, we'll typically go between 2 and 3 weeks of maceration for that as well. Things like seeds, it's particularly important to put them in a grinder or blend them up to get them powderized, because oftentimes seeds do have that protective barrier that doesn't allow the alcohol to penetrate through. Milk thistle seed is one of those, where we specifically will grind that up before tincturing it, just because it does have a hard outer layer of that shell that we want to break in order to get that penetration so the constituents can come out more readily. Got the percolation, you've got fluid extract, which is essentially a double extraction method. You're doing the same thing as you're going to be doing with your tincture. However, after you have your tincture for a certain period of time, you're going to strain it off and then use the mark. And the mark is essentially that leftover herb that you've got, and add water to it and cook it down. The reason you do this for a fluid extract is essentially it is a highly concentrated extraction of your herb and tincture mixed with a extraction in water. So you're getting the best of all worlds. You're getting the alkaloids, or the medicinal constituents of the plant, plus vitamins and minerals that are coming from the water extraction process. Some great herbs to use for a fluid extract are things like dandelion, things like yellow dock, burdock. Those are 3 great examples, because they're going to not only have great medicinal qualities to it, but they're also going to have a lot of those really strong vitamins and minerals that are going to be really good for your body. So you marry the 2 again, and that creates what's called a fluid extract. So it's kind of a power punch kick, interesting sort of formula that's different from just a regular tincture. And then of course you have your mucopolysaccharides. Mucopolysaccharides is a fancy word for a mushroom tincture, and it follows sort of a similar extraction process as fluid extract, where again it's a double extraction method that's happening, where you're working to get certain aspects of the mushroom from water and heat, and then from the tincture process as well. So if you're trying to get scientific with it, there's a whole method and modality of how to make tinctures. If you want to just make some tinctures at home, you can get vodka and pour it over your plant and make a tincture. Certain plants require higher alcohol percentages than others, or so they've kind of through trial and error and study have found. Things like resins, myrrh, for example, tend to need a higher alcohol percentage than something like licorice, which tends to need a lower alcohol percentage to preserve it and extract it. So if you're at home and you want to make a tincture and you don't want to get all crazy and find Everclear and try and mix it with distilled water and go down that road, you don't have to. You can oftentimes simply use something like brandy, or vodka is another common one that folks use, and do a folk method, or you can kind of do a more specific approach to it, where you have a 1 to 2 extraction or 1 to 5, and just pour the alcohol on top of it. So if you're going to do that, again, you chop your herb up if it's fresh, put it in your jar, pour the alcohol over it, let it sit. At least 2 weeks for flowers and leaves, 2 to 3 weeks for powder, and more like a month for roots and woodier aspects of a plant. You can get into the nitty-gritty, and that's not the folk method. If you're trying to be more exact with making a tincture, a fresh herb is more of a 1 to 2 ratio, and it is 2.5 pounds, 2 to 2.5 pounds, depending on the herb, to 80 ounces of alcohol. Or if you're doing a smaller amount, you would just calculate it down. For dried herbs, it tends to be a 1 to 3 to a 1 to 5 ratio of herb to alcohol. 1 pound dried herb to about 80 ounces of alcohol. And then the menstruum percentage, or the rate of alcohol to water, can vary with the herb. And if you're interested in learning more about that, down on the bottom here is a link to Michael Moore's Materia Medica on tincturing, and he's got a bunch of different herbs specific to New Mexico, and also just other herbs that are commonly used in herbalism, with the alcohol percentage and typical dosage of how you would take it. So a little example I've got, so if you're trying to tincture 80 ounces of dried licorice powder, the standard practice is 50%. So you are going to simply do 40 ounces of alcohol and 40 ounces of distilled water, or regular water if you don't have distilled water. I kind of flew through that, but does anyone have any questions on that process? Cool. So the last one is glycerin. And glycerin, again, is an old method of extraction, and it's one that I don't personally have a lot of experience with. It is an interesting substance in that it's contained in fats from both the vegetable and the animal origin. And it comes through this process. I don't really fully understand the process, but it's kind of a byproduct of the animal fat or the vegetable fat. Does anyone know kind of a little bit more about glycerin in that process? Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about it, but you can do some research and find out more. The interesting thing about it, though it has like a very viscous sweet taste to it, is it's not a carbohydrate and it doesn't contain sugar, so it's not going to alter glycemic levels within the blood. So some folks have a worry about that, where they're wondering if it's going to affect their blood sugar. And so what folks tend to say is that it actually doesn't, I don't know what the glycemic index of it is, but it doesn't tend to elevate blood sugar levels like sugar would, even though it tastes sweet. On its own, it's great. It's an antibacterial, it's a demulcent, it's an emollient, lubricating, it soothes skin and mucous membranes. So it has a lot of really wonderful medicinal qualities to itself. And then when you add herbs to it, it's a great alternative to alcohol for folks who either have problems with alcohol or just simply don't want to do a tincture. It's a really good alternative. It's also great for kids. Especially since it doesn't necessarily have that glycemic index, it's going to elevate the blood sugar levels. It's going to be a good one to help kids kind of take that medicine down a little bit better. And then I found in one of my favorite books, which I'll show to you in a little bit, some of these different preparation ratios of straight glycerin, glycerite, or if you're going to mix it with some vinegar, or if you do want to mix it with some alcohol. So there's different ratios and ways to prepare it. So essentially it's kind of ranges from about a 1:4 to a 1:10 ratio for the extraction process. That's kind of all I'll say on glycerin because I don't know a whole lot about it, but if you're interested in learning more, there is definitely a lot of information out there. So I don't have a slide on it, but I'll talk a little bit about flower essences. I used to not really be into them, but I've over the years come to appreciate them more. They kind of function on more of an energetic level for the body. And I think they're really great. And I think it's something worth exploring for people who are interested in kind of understanding the energetics of herbs a little bit more. And kind of the process of making them varies from person to person, but folks will tend to either have the plant next to typically spring water or very, very pure form of water. They'll put the plant next to the water or they'll set it gently on top. People will do it over a full moon or depending on what the full moon is, what sign it's in, or how they're feeling, or they'll simply do it overnight, or they'll set it in the sun for a period of time. So there's kind of different ways that people will extract that plant depending on their preference. And essentially that extraction process, then that water becomes the mother. And so you've got a bowl of water that has the energetics of the plant, and you take a small portion of that mother and put it in, most people use brandy, and then that creates your flower essence. And so there's a lot more information to it, and you can kind of like research it on your own and figure out your own way of doing it if that's something you're interested in. But yeah, they're just another form of medicine, kind of working on a different level of the body, and often kind of work on the emotional spirit, but work on other aspects as well, and are an interesting thing to research. So to close it up, I wanted to kind of just show you and give you a list of some of my favorite books. They tend to kind of be on the more Western herbalism side of things, and there are a lot of other books out there that are not. And depending on where you come from and what you are learning, there I'm sure are a lot of different books, kind of cultural books that talk about plants, or even different family members that might have a lot of knowledge to kind of hand down. So just to say that, like, these are typically more on the Western side of things, but there's also a lot of different information on some Ayurveda and other things as well in there. And this is definitely not an exhaustive list of books. This is just what I have in my own little arsenal personally, and it's not even the whole thing. So a couple of favorites for me, especially if you're in New Mexico. This one right here, this is Eat Mesquite and More. So it's a great cookbook on cooking native plants in New Mexico. It's one that the Native Plant Society actually puts out and sells. So you could probably contact them if you were interested in getting this book. Another one of my favorites that might be a good one for folks who really want to dive deeper into making medicine is the Herbal Medicine Maker's Handbook. Kind of looks like that. And that is by James Green. And so it kind of actually goes more specific into a lot of different aspects of medicine making and talks about different herbs in the book and different modalities of making medicine and covers everything that I talked about in even more depth and detail. So that's a really good book as well. Some folks expressed interest in learning about beauty products. So this is the Natural Beauty Recipe book. So it's kind of, it's pretty basic, but it's fun to kind of, you know, take as a foundation and branch off of. Rosemary Gladstar is always a tried and true. She's a great one. The Herbal Recipes for Vibrant Health. You know, most people who are in the herbal world know Rosemary Gladstar. If you're interested in herbal business, Growing Your Herb Business was a really interesting book for me to read by Bertha Rupper. Braiding Sweetgrass is always a good one. I'm still in the process of reading it, but it's more of, it's less just like a reference book and more of just kind of, you know, an account of life and herbs and people. If you're interested in growing herbs yourself, we've got the Homegrown Herbs book, which is a fun one, and it's by Tammy Hartung. So it goes over all sorts of different herbs and the different climate conditions that they tolerate, soil levels, moisture, things like that. So if you're interested in cultivation, that's a really good one for you. And then, of course, anything by Michael Moore is great. Botany in a Day is another really good one to learn plant families and understand botanical aspects of the plant. But yeah, like I said, there is just an overwhelming amount of resources out there. And I think books are great. I think that the internet gets kind of overwhelming, and it's good to come back to some of those old school books that are out there that have been tried and true, because the information is changing, but it's mostly stayed the same. Herbs are great, and they have their aspects, and what people found out about them a long time ago still remains to be true. People just continue to expand on that. So with that, like I said, I'm going to send this off to you with a lot more information as well. But for those of you who have the package, your DIY goodie bag, you're going to be making your own lip balm. Essentially, it's got coconut oil, comfrey in there, a little bit of beeswax, filtration cloth, and chapstick tubes and little labels for you to use. So you are, I'll send you the recipe, but basically you're kind of mixing it all together, straining it off and pouring it into your chapstick tubes. And it essentially functions in the same way that a salve does. So you're kind of learning how to make salve, but then you get a chapstick out of it. And I think that's what I got for you. I'm only 4 minutes behind. I kind of got through it. Yeah, so I didn't cover a whole lot of specific, you know, herbs. It was more of the process, but you will, in your packet that you're going to get within the next couple of days, it's going to have a lot more information. I have a whole kind of a slideshow on various herbs that are both native to New Mexico, but also herbs that are widely available. So you'll be receiving that so you can get a little bit more information specific to herbs and herbal uses, as well as some more in-depth information on herbal preparation and bioregional uses. And then everybody is also going to get a 15% off flyer for if you're interested in exploring any more of Artemisia's products and purchasing. And if you'd like to be on our newsletter, We send that out once a month with different deals and specials that are going on, as well as kind of our herb of the month and different recipes and interesting things that are going on in the herbal world or kind of with the health community at large. So it's just a great way to stay connected and to continue to receive more information, as well as more information about any other upcoming workshops that might be happening. We're definitely trying to expand more of our educational opportunities with people, and I think there's a lot that we can do and a lot more information if people are interested in receiving it. So yeah, that's what I got. And if anybody's got any last questions, feel free to ask them now.
I actually have a question. Can you make, like, instead of honey, could you use like maple syrup maybe, or any other kind of syrup, or is it just honey?
Yeah, you can definitely. So, I mean, I would say that you can use most things to extract. You may get different properties of the plant depending on what you're using, but I know that folks have done infusions in maple syrup before, and yeah, I would say try it out and see what happens.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, for sure.
Sarah, it says to add a bit of alcohol to your dried comfrey. What kind of alcohol are we talking about?
You can add a little bit of vodka or just anything. So what we found when we are making our oils from the dried powder is the alcohol actually kind of tends to activate the herb and helps it to extract in the oil a little bit better. But you definitely don't, it's optional and you don't have to do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would something like witch hazel or rubbing alcohol work in lieu of other types of alcohol?
Yeah, I mean, people definitely will do extractions in witch hazel. What was the other one you said? Did you say rubbing alcohol?
Yes.
So I think that people have done extractions in rubbing alcohol. I wouldn't take that internally though, personally. You can do an extraction and use it topically. You know, oftentimes, I didn't go over this, but alcohol extractions can also be considered what they call liniments, and you can use that topically on the skin. So for example, if you did like an arnica St. John's wort extraction and then used it topically, it'd be considered a liniment. It's great for pain and nerve issues. So I would say if you're going to use rubbing alcohol, if that's what you've got, maybe stick to topical use for that. But the witch hazel, yes, you can definitely extract with that and use it topically, and you can use it internally as well. And it does a pretty good job of extraction.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Great. Well, if any other questions come up while you're doing any projects or medicine making, you're welcome to email us at artemisiaherbsnm.com or the email that we've been emailing you from. We're happy to answer any questions that you have come up during the process or about herbs or whatever comes up. We're happy to help and want to just kind of give as much free information as we can so that you have the empowerment to do all of this yourself, because you can. And yeah, so I hope that this was informational for you and at least somewhat entertaining and not totally boring, but yeah, that you can kind of take away and start making stuff on your own.
I want to thank you and tell you you did a great job. That's incredible what you pulled together tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was great. Really great. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sarah.
for sure. And I, like I said, I think I got it all, I believe I got it recorded. So hopefully I'll be able to have a recording for you as well. So thank you, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.